Good afternoon, everybody. It's 2:40, and I'm going to get started. I am Laurie Olsen, and welcome to my talk, which is on Not Again, Opportunities and Dangers for English Learners in the Common Core Era. And I'm going to take you on a little journey with me through quite a bit of years I've spent as an advocate, a researcher, an educator for English learners, but really focusing in on what led me to create and design a preschool to third grade biliteracy demonstration project. I'll share some of the evaluation results with you from that project, and then hone in on what does that have to do with what I think our task is at this moment as the Common Core is rolling out, because I think this is really a crucial moment in the history of English learner education. So my story is going to start with a little bit of history back in 1974, and we just heard Ed Steinman at the luncheon, who was the lawyer that argued for in the Lau v. Nichols Supreme Court decision. But it's where the Supreme Court really laid clear, of course, that our schools had an obligation to provide the targeted, specific services that English learners need, and to not just do the same thing with them we're doing with everybody else, or else we'd be foreclosing them from equal educational opportunity. And that moment in time really set off what was years and years and years of a whole roller coaster of efforts to build programs, English learner and bilingual programs, to build the expertise and the knowledge and the understanding and the research about what the needs of English learners really look like and how to meet those needs in schools, and years of developing the pre-service credential and professional development approaches that would prepare teachers and how to do it. Lots and lots of work that just got set off at that time. But along the way, that journey was always riddled with politics. The education of English learners in this country has always been very closely related to national political battles over immigration and demographic change and diversity and civil rights and language policy. And so throughout the 90s, the 80s and the 90s, all of that work to try to figure out how to do these programs and figure out what was working with English learners and really create a field was really affected by what was going on around it, and in particular the language wars, the English-only movement, the anti-bilingual initiatives that took place in California and many other states around the nation. And so there was a lot that was deflecting and pushing and shaping what was happening for English learners during that time. Even though the turn to the 21st century, I think there was a lot of thawing of those battles, the scars from them are still there. And that's the terrain in which the Common Core is now being implemented. So to me, the advent of the Common Core, which we know is reshaping education in this country, having been adopted by almost all states, and calling for a very different kind of teaching pedagogy and a different kind of focus and different set of standards. This is really a crucial moment for us to really pause and think about what is this looking like for English learners, and what have we learned from our history about how to make it a reform that's really going to work for English learners. Because actually, as I think you know, I can't really see you, but I know you're out there, and I've been around the conference, and there are a lot of people that have been in this field for a long time. We don't have much of a track record about school reforms that really deliver for English learners. And in fact, what we do have is a history of school reform after school reform that comes along promising a lot, sounding like good, solid ideas. We jump on the bandwagon, we try to make them work. Millions of dollars go into their implementation, hours of professional development and curriculum realignment, only to find years down the road, whoops, didn't really work for English learners, or once again, they were left behind. And so the gap was maintained, and in some cases actually made worse by those reforms. So as we enter this era of the Common Core, I think we really have to be very, very cognizant of what can go wrong, what that looks like, and what we have to do about it. I think of it in terms of what I call the lacks. these basic conditions that just seem to permeate so much of what happens out in schools. One of them is just the lack of awareness that English learners are even there, that they're in your classes, that they're in your school, that they're in your community, to what extent they're there, who they are. Then there's the lack of understanding of what they need, and the fact that language actually is a real impediment to, lack of English is really an impediment to being able to comprehend what's happening, to be able to participate in school. The lack of knowledge about what to do and how to do it, and the skills and the strategies to meet the needs of English learners. And then even in places where they might have that knowledge, the lack of resources, lack of time, lack of making it a priority to meet those needs, and then in too many places still a lack of will to do something for those kids, or a lack of belief that they really could do it anyway. So the assumption ends up being, if they're not doing well, if that gap is still there, maybe there's something wrong with those kids. So those are the lacks. And in 2001, when No Child Left Behind came in, actually there was a lot of possibility with No Child Left Behind, because it tried to take on one of those lacks, the lack around awareness, by making English learners a significant subgroup that people had to look at, that data was being collected around. And we did see a lot more attention paid to English learners in that time. It raised awareness, there was a lot more activity done around meeting the needs of English learners. But that was never in isolation of those other lacks, the lack of expertise, the lack of real knowledge, the lack of belief that the kids could do it. And it was always still in the context of the political battles. So No Child Left Behind ended up being a disappointment as well for English learners, as you know, largely leaving the gaps intact. It came in on the heels of some of the worst years of the language wars and the English-only movement. Here in California, Prop 227 had passed. And so the attitudes and the beliefs around English learners and around language really infused how No Child Left Behind was being implemented. We ended up with an English-only accountability system, English-only assessments that mattered for accountability. And so there was kind of this perfect storm, because schools with bilingual programs were penalized, of course, by the test scores. Schools with large numbers of English learners who, by definition, aren't going to be able to look proficient in English on the test scores in an English-only accountability system. And so the number of students receiving bilingual education plummeted precipitously to about 5% of kids that now get primary language instruction in California. And because so many of the schools with large numbers of English learners can't show proficiency in English for those English learners, they were among the first schools to go into corrective action. The corrective action system was designed by people largely with very little understanding of English learners, very little knowledge base or expertise in this area, and so there were some very negative, unintended consequences that resulted. One of them was that if you go into corrective action, kids are not doing well in English, English language arts, more minutes of English, more minutes of English, more minutes of English become mandated. And what got squeezed out was science, social studies, the arts, a narrowed curriculum. There was an insistence on fidelity to core programs, and the core programs themselves were not really designed well for English learners. And so schools were being held more and more accountable for delivering that core program within this very narrowed curriculum. And so we learned the hard way, again, that reforms that are designed without expertise about English learners at the table, without people at the table that really know what English learners need and what will work for them, are not going to produce results for English learners. A mere focus on the fact of their underachievement in No Child Left Behind with that subgroup focus was not sufficient to produce the solutions. So as that was really unrolling and we were seeing the gap just stubbornly remaining, I was moving around the state, working with high schools and districts throughout the state on the long-term English learner issue. And what we were finding was that about 3 out of 5 of the students sitting there, English learners in grades 6 through 12, were these long-term English learners, students who'd been in our schools, most of them since kindergarten, students who were stuck at this basic level of bare social English fluency, enough to get along, but not enough to participate academically, and losing their home language while they were doing it, and amassing larger and larger academic gaps, falling further and further behind academically. And while their presence was really obvious in the high schools I was working with, it became very clear to us that this was an issue that starts earlier, that it started way back the first day they entered kindergarten, where they walk in, these young, fresh, 5-year-old minds when the brain is wired actually for language development. It's the perfect time for developing language, with the dreams of their families and their communities on their shoulders as the first generation, most of them to be educated in the United States. They walk into classrooms with teachers who work really, really hard to try to make it work for them, and yet 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later, they're still stuck at that very minimal level of English oral proficiency. So what is it that happens to them when they walk into schools? Well, one thing is they learn, from the moment they walk in, they learn silence. They're not comprehending what's happening. They don't have the language. They're not able to participate. They stay under the radar. Their teachers just look at them as maybe well-behaved or something. Later on, they get looked at as lazy and behavior issues because they're not doing their homework. But they learn silence and non-participation. They sit in those classes without science, without social studies, without most of the curriculum except hours and hours in language arts, which is through programs that weren't really designed for them because this was the No Child Left Behind era, amassing greater and greater academic gaps as they go through the years. Californians Together, our wonderful coalition, published a report on long-term English learners to try to really bring it to the state's attention, which it in fact did throughout the state. But I became really interested in working at the other end of things. What is it that we need to do to prevent the creation of long-term English learners? And just while that was going on in my mind, very fortuitously, the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Children and Youth released their report. This meta-analysis of research studies that had been done throughout the country on issues of literacy and language development for this population. And for the first time, we had this coherent, powerful statement of the best of what research was telling us. What do we really know looking across all of these kind of reports? And there were some really clear findings from that. Among them was the crucial role of oral language, which the National Literacy Panel pointed out was largely and increasingly disappearing from instruction under the weight of an accountability system that was only looking at reading and writing. But the huge role of oral language, the important role of home language and the development of home language. They affirmed that bilingual outcomes are in fact equal to or greater than English-only programs. So there was a lot that was in that report that was so important and gave us a real foundation to build upon. And it was about that time, as that report came out, I was looking around and seeing throughout the state that, great, we've got this research, but you know, the distance between the research and what was happening on the ground was huge and was going in the opposite direction. What we were seeing in terms of practices on the ground, what we were seeing in terms of policy, reflected a basic set of beliefs, myths, misconceptions, which were things like the sooner and more fully immersed in English, the better. That if they're not doing very well in English, you just add more minutes in studying the English language, because it's the most important subject, so if it freezes out those other things, that doesn't really matter. Other things can wait. The notion that good teaching, good standards-based curriculum works for all students and ought to be sufficient for English learners, and so we've got good basic strategies or a good reform, and it ought to work for everybody. The notion that home language holds kids back or is wasted time, precious minutes of the day wasted in home language in school, bilingual programs don't work. All of that kind of belief system was really infused through what was happening out in schools. And that's the moment where I was sitting there and I got a phone call. My phone call was, Hello, Laurie. This is the Sobrato Family Foundation. We're a private philanthropy, and we want to do something about the achievement gap facing Hispanics and English learners in this country. And we've been looking around for powerful program models, and we want to know if you're interested in designing something that will really significantly close the achievement gap and really address the language needs of these students. So I jumped at the chance because I was feeling all of that sense of urgency about wanting to really put a model out there that prevented the creation of long-term English learners. I was feeling all the sense of disappointment and kind of despair at seeing what No Child Left Behind had wrought and that era of reform had wrought. And I was looking at the National Literacy Panel research and thinking, whoa, there's all this wonderful stuff to build on. So that's how the SEAL model came about. It's a preschool through third grade, trying to leverage those early years, an early solid foundation of education. It was focused a lot on Spanish-speaking English learner kids, but because of all my experience with school reform and school change, I know that that's not how you change schools, and so we work school-wide. It's a school-wide model, all teachers across the grade levels, pre-K through 3, all kids. And it's an articulated program, preschool through third grade, but age appropriate, that was really geared not just towards sort of kinder readiness and sort of that basic readiness, but what does a foundation look like that really sets them off for high level, wonderful, powerful academic engagement. And so our vision was certainly mastery of grade level content, of course, and certainly basic language and literacy, but it was beyond that. It was about creating kids who were confident, motivated, engaged, curious, excited learners, and who, whenever we could do it, were becoming biliterate. So the thing is, as I was working on designing all of this and all of the excitement about it, I saw the Common Core standards coming down the pike, and I knew that our SEAL model had to be one that was responding to the Common Core. And this is what it was meaning to me. So, I mean, obviously, the Common Core standards would be implemented in the classrooms, as they are in every classroom in states that have the Common Core. But I was looking at some bigger shifts about the Common Core also as very significant to the SEAL design. The first thing is just that basic recognition. You know what? We've been on a trajectory of the way we've been thinking about what proficient for academic purposes looks like and what the kind of English you need for academic purposes is. But in fact, as that definition is changing under the Common Core, we have to rethink the whole trajectory of what it means and what it looks like to develop the language for academic purposes for our English learners. But the shifts that I really focused on were number one. From that old paradigm where you learn English first and then you can get to content and sort of the content can wait, or the notion that you learn language over here and over here is all the other academics and maybe there's a little overlap around academic vocabulary. The shift that I was focusing on was much more about language in the Common Core is positioned in and across all content areas, right? It's how you learn history and social studies and science and math and language arts. It's through language you negotiate meaning in all of that, and that each of those areas has a language to it that needs to be learned by our students. So you can't separate language learning from all those other subjects. The other three things that were really key in the shaping of the SEAL model about the Common Core was, hallelujah, speaking and listening standards for all students in the Common Core. This increased focus, this understanding about how important oral language is and mastery of oral language and speaking and listening was huge. The focus on more rigorous, higher level text and informational text, so they'd be reading about and talking about and learning about science and social studies in the world. And the shift toward much more focus on collaboration and inquiry and active engagement and sort of those 21st century 4Cs skills right there in the Common Core and in next generation science standards, et cetera, as well. So those were some of the things we were picking up on. I was looking at that time at the Common Core as just this enormous opportunity because there was so much of it that was aligned with a vision around what best practices for English learners really ought to be. And it represented a significant departure from some of the kind of teaching pedagogy and curricular pedagogy that we were seeing in schools that that we'd been through the No Child Left Behind era, and really unlocking a different kind of possibility in classrooms. So I was really excited. I viewed it as a key foundation for where the SEAL model came from, and I was also very aware walking into the SEAL model that the rigor and the challenges of the Common Core were so great for English learners that if we didn't start working on the models of what the Common Core needs to look like for English learners, we were going to be in trouble with this new era of reform as well. So the SEAL model was rooted in those three circles. Long-term English learner research, being sure the kids are actively engaged and that language is happening right from the start, that they're getting the full curriculum. The Common Core standards, that best practices research from National Literacy Panel and other places. So there were four key aspects to the SEAL model. I'm going to take you through a little bit of the model and the findings right now. One is just the alignment of the preschool through the K-3 system, because that age developmental phase from age 4 to age 8 is such an important time in language learning. And by the way, it's one of those crucial windows where native-like proficiency in more than one language is really possible to develop. And so we wanted to really capture that, but those are two very different systems that don't speak to each other, very different curriculum and pedagogy and philosophy, et cetera. So we would need to knit those systems together. A focus on academic language, absolutely complex language, wonderful, rich oral language, biliteracy was the second big pillar. The third is parents and teachers working together. This was about both parent education and a real partnership between parents and teachers, and an affirming environment. So it happens through standards-based thematic curriculum that occurs throughout the day. So we're using next generation science standards, we're using social studies content standards, we're using the math standards, we use the Common Core language arts standards. We put those together into a thematic connection, use the same high leverage language strategies, infusing real emphasis on language and engagement throughout everything, the same vocabulary occurring throughout the day, et cetera, and then use these 12 kind of buckets of what I think of as the instructional approach, the pedagogical practice. So I'm going to take you through some examples of them just so you get a picture. The first one is complex, precise academic language. And by that we mean, these are little ones, these are preschool, this is a transportation unit, they're down on the rug with their cars and their trucks. The teacher has taught the language of bumpers and fenders and carburetors and hoods and license plates, not because that's typical academic language, but because the basic message for young ones is just the world can be described in ever more precise, complex ways, and it's vocabulary that gives you a way into understanding what it is you're learning about. And so the teacher's monitoring what kind of language are they using on the rug, getting into the conversations with them, et cetera. Here's another preschool picture, which just shows that this was a plant unit, and they're planting their seeds, typical kind of young child stuff, but they're learning germination as a word, as a language. The vocabulary we choose is the language that is most complex and precise and wonderful and expressive and really matches the cognitive tasks they're doing. The second area of high leverage pedagogical practice is just a lot of structured oral interaction. Oral language is happening all the time in our classrooms. So it might be small group activities. It starts with the little ones learning just in school. You do turn to your people and talk to people about what you're learning. And that means looking at them in the eye and speaking audibly and all those really, really, really early skills that grow up to support the kind of engagement in academic discussion later. Shared interactive dialogic read-alouds, talking about what you're reading, predicting, summarizing, using all those good reader behaviors, but really becoming engaged through dialogic read-alouds. Story and narrative retell, whether it's through puppet shows or kids replaying the pictures and telling the stories to each other, making it their own, learning the whole narrative structure as they're doing it, but producing language. And here they are acting out. It moves into theater as they get older. As they get further into the unit. Children as readers, the skills of reading for absolute sure, but also the opportunities to read, classroom libraries, informational text that's connected to what they're learning about. The sixth area is checks for comprehension. So the teachers have multiple ways. They're constantly listening into what kids are saying, looking at student work, whole groups having many different strategies for what are kids comprehending, one-on-one working with children, what are they understanding, and modifying instruction. Because in SEAL classrooms, there are going to be no long-term English learners created. We're going to know when kids aren't comprehending. We're going to know what they need. We're going to be monitoring that and moving them along. The seventh area is just lots of graphic organizers and visuals. We know it promotes comprehension for English learners, but graphic organizers also help shape cognitive processes too in the brain. So you can look around a SEAL classroom and see what they're learning about. Lots and lots of photos, lots and lots of visuals, lots and lots of graphics created with the students together to organize information. Number 8 is dramatic play. These are little ones, and young children learn through play. So this is an All About Me unit, and they have a cardiologist office, and so that's the dramatic play. This is an insects unit, so it's an entomologist lab, where they're able to use microscopes and magnifying glasses and draw pictures of what they're observing, young scientists in action. Number 9 is children as writers, authentic writing, and a lot of work on the craft of writing, writer's workshop, etc. It starts with the preschoolers as dictation and seeing their words turn into print and then able to read those back. Becomes group editing, group writing, and then moves into individual. Number 10 is collaboration and teamwork, a hugely important skill in and of itself, excuse me, but also that's where language comes alive, the need to put your thoughts into print, to build on each other's ideas. It's key in the Common Core, and it would be key to SEAL even if the Common Core didn't exist. Number 11 is arts infusion, because we're serious about access to the full curriculum and because arts is a means into expression and comprehension about the world. Number 12 is just the world in their classroom, which means several things. It means bringing things, tangible things, into them where they can touch them, they can observe them, they could really study them. But it also means their language having a place. So this is a celebration at one of our schools, second and third graders that tested proficient or above on the standards test in Spanish and on the CSTs in English, California Standards Test. Just a celebration of the bilingualism and how important that bilingualism is. And the world in the classroom also includes parents, families, present in the classroom, their culture present in the classroom, and in the materials. So this kind of education doesn't come easy. It's a big shift for a lot of the teachers. Standards-based thematic units you have to create, understanding the standards, this kind of deep immersion in language. And so it's supported by a whole infrastructure and approach that speaks to those lacks I mentioned at the very beginning. Intensive professional development. Those teachers really learn about language, dual language development, the needs of English learners. A lot of teacher collaboration time, what the standards really mean, how to put it together, how it's working. Systems support, so leadership development, help with designing more research-based programs for English learners, and it requires some purchase of materials because you cannot teach this way out of a single teacher guide and out of a set of books that's purchased off the shelf. So this has been evaluated by Catherine Lindholm-Leary, who brought all of her wonderful expertise in dual language education to bear on our evaluation. And I'm going to just share a few things from you and then turn back to this issue of, well, what does this have to do with the era of the Common Core and what Laurie said was such a high-stakes moment. We pilot it in 2 districts, 3 elementary schools, 13 feeder preschools in Redwood City and San Jose, California. We have full data sets longitudinally from the beginning on 793 kids. And that first cohort started preschool in 2008. We built the model up each year as they moved through school. I'm just going to turn to this chart. Our kids in the SEAL classrooms are not like the district and state comparison groups, but we use the state and district comparison groups because that's the data that we had. And you can see our kids were many more, our schools are more heavily impacted by English learners. They're more heavily Hispanic. Many more kids struggling with issues of low income and on free and reduced lunch. And then this last one, almost twice as many of our parents have a high school diploma or less as compared to the state that they're compared to. But what we found is that through our work, more than half of the SEAL parents participate actively in language and literacy activities at home with their kids at least twice a week, and that they're more likely to than a national sample of Hispanic families, and as likely as this national sample of college-educated parents. So remember, this is a parent group with very low education, and what they're engaged with reading to their kids, asking questions of their kids, engaging in writing projects with their kids, is similar to college-educated parents nationwide. That preschool year is hugely important, and I'm not going to go into the measures right now, but these little ones are coming in with very low language, even in their home language, very little production of language. They make excellent statistically significant growth across the preschool year, and the great majority of them, 3 out of 4, end up that preschool year kinder ready in the top 2 levels of the DRDP, which is one of the assessments we use, and the LOSS. They get to kindergarten, and just looking at the English part of it, English progress, 60% of our SEAL classrooms, by the way, are bilingual classrooms. So think about the English progress in that context. They start still low in English, even after that preschool year, but over the time they make significant progress. So those of you who are used to thinking of AMAOs and progress on English proficiency, 1 level per year is the general norm. We have our kids 34% moving up 1 level, 45% up 2 or more levels. We have our kids just bouncing around long in English because of the rigor of what's happening in Spanish. If our cohorts were a school in and of themselves, they would have all met state accountability targets for growth in English proficiency. If you look just the kindergarten to 1st grade year, this shows how our kindergartners start lower than the state and the district on CELT, and at the end of that year, the trajectory of growth is significantly greater, so they've caught up to the state. And again, remember that they've started with all of these other traditional things that make achievement much more difficult. The cumulative impact, if you compare where they are on CELT over a 2-year period, those who've been in SEAL classrooms that whole time are showing much greater growth than those who only had 1 year of SEAL or 2 years of SEAL. They're stronger than the district and state in where they show up on CELT, so they're doing better than those comparison groups. And then we turn to the California Standards Test, which is our grade level standards test in English language arts. So this is English, this is end of 2nd grade. And you can see that those who are full CELT kids, how many, full SEAL, have gotten to proficient and advanced as compared to partial SEAL, district averages, state averages, and typical dual language programs. And I put in the dual language comparison on purpose, not to say that dual language doesn't work, but because we know the trajectory. We have enough research in the field to know that in a dual language biliteracy program, usually at the end of 2nd grade, they don't look so good in English compared to those that are in English-only instruction, but you catch up and surpass down the road. But our SEAL students are surpassing at the end of 2nd grade. On the Spanish side, we see the same kind of pattern, that the rigor in Spanish is really paying off in how many are proficient or advanced on the standards test in Spanish. On math, we see the same kinds of patterns, and I put in a couple things for you. The comparison of those SEAL classrooms that are bilingual versus those that are the English-only instructed classrooms, because remember, we work across all schools. The bilingual program kids start lower in language. It's a different population, a different demographic that signs up for the bilingual program versus the SEI English program, with almost 20 to 40 point differences in language scores. But the children in both of them make significant progress, better than comparison groups, and so our English-only instructed classrooms are also making awesome progress. But the largest gains for each cohort, for every time period, for every measure, are made by the kids in the bilingual program. By 3rd grade, students who are in the bilingual instruction score similar to or higher than students that received English instruction on every single test, whether it's CELT, whether it's the CST in English, whether it's the standards test in Spanish. So I have some slides there for you just to see them. I'm not going to talk you through them. What we know anyway from all of the work that's been done before, and it makes sense, how rigorous and strong your Spanish is reflected in how strong your English will be. And we saw that borne out in our data as well. And then the last thing I want to say from the evaluation is because we're tracking what's happening to kids in both languages, even if they're in the English-only instructed classrooms, what we see is tremendous language loss on the Spanish side for those kids that went into English-only instruction. So they're doing well in English compared to other kids that are also in English-only programs that are not SEAL, but they are losing out on the Spanish side, so that by third grade entry, only 0 to 4% of them are age-appropriate fluent in their primary language anymore, compared to 2/3 or more on the Spanish side. So that is the data. And were this any other year at NABE and any other presentation, that would probably be the end of my presentation right there. Hey, we did this demonstration project, and we implemented the Common Core, and we found that biliteracy approaches really worked with the Common Core, and it's doable, and it's great, hooray. But this isn't an ordinary year, and this is where I want to spend our last 15 or so minutes together. Because all around us, there's another reality. The Common Core is being implemented. You see it everywhere. You hear it everywhere. Every journal, every magazine, every conference, everything's about the Common Core this, the Common Core that, right? Everybody's implementing it. But those lacks that I mentioned at the beginning, they are still there. The lack of understanding of the needs of English learners, all of those myths and misconceptions are still there. And nothing has changed that picture. As everyone's jumped into the Common Core implementation, they're doing it on a foundation that is very weak with regard to English learners. Weak English learner programs, weak understanding, teachers without the skills they really need and the strategies they really need to meet the needs of English learners. And even with the less rigorous standards before the Common Core, we weren't able to get kids to the bar of proficiency that we wanted to get them to, right? Many were failing, many were becoming long-term English learners. And now the Common Core is here with its more rigorous standards, and we really have to ask, what's it gonna take to make this work now? The Common Core implemented without a serious focus on English learners is gonna be another reform that is a nail in the coffin and leaves them behind. The Common Core standards themselves are neutral on how you make it work for different populations. It was left to the states to develop their own English language proficiency standards and approach to that. And here in California, it was a full 2 years after the Common Core had been adopted and people started working on it before our ELD standards came out, even though it was on an incredible fast track here in California. And when they were released, it was a surprise to the field the extent to which the new ELD vision and standards differed from the old ones, were as significant as the way in which the Common Core differed from what had been happening before. So the new standards moved us to a whole different vision about ELD. It moved us to this vision that just like language is positioned across all of these academic areas now under the Common Core, so too is ELD. And so our new California standards for ELD have this notion of integrated ELD that's happening in and through all of those other subject areas. The ELD standards are to be used in tandem with other content standards in planning by all teachers. So that's in addition to the designated separate ELD. And the implications are huge, because now we're talking all teachers needing to take this on. We're talking about it being entwined throughout all curriculum. We're talking about requiring a level of collaboration between ELD planning and the rest of the curriculum planning that has never happened before. And where and when and how is that going to happen? It's this wonderful, robust vision of what ELD is about and English learner language development needs to be. But how are we going to make it happen? For teachers and districts that were already knee-deep in the Common Core, 2 years into their work on all of this, to take on the ELD standards, we have some big questions. And one of the big questions that I have is, did we get to the party too late already? I'm going to share with you, I work all over the state with districts, and I'm going to share with you some quotes. And I want you to just be thinking as I'm reading these, is this what it looks like for English learners to be left behind? Quote, The new ELD standards, I haven't had a chance to really look at them yet. We know they're important for teachers to get acquainted with, but there's so much on our agendas now, we just don't see when it can happen. Maybe we can schedule something, maybe 20 minutes at a faculty meeting, just so teachers know there are some new ELD standards. Quote, our teachers are just wrapping their heads around the new Common Core units we've created. We can't add to their overwhelm. It's too much to ask. Quote, it's the humanities folks in our district who've taken on the Common Core work, and all our PD days are already booked by them, and they don't really listen to the English Learner office anyway. So we're planning a voluntary after-school and a Saturday session on the new ELD standards for interested teachers. Quote, we'd have to train our Common Core literacy coaches, and they have no background on English learner issues. Maybe next year we'll schedule a professional development for those coaches, and they can find a way to integrate it into their work with teachers. Quote, we're using Phyllis as our PD consultant on the Common Core, doing great work with teachers. They really love her. It's great strategies. She assures us that her strategies work for all students. So English learners are really being addressed in her work with teachers because the strategies just work for everybody. No, she hasn't looked at the new ELD standard. She said she doesn't really believe in ELD and the Common Core doesn't really require it. These are all real quotes, I'm telling you. So I want you to do one thing, a stretch at this point in the afternoon is good. I want you to raise your right hand to represent how much is going on around the Common Core in your schools or districts or state. Just like a huge amount, a medium-sized little bit. So raise that hand and just keep it there for a minute. And then with your left hand, I want you to put it down where what represents how much focus has there been on English language proficiency or ELD standards. Okay, so that distance is part of what we need to be looking at. Because leaving English learners behind not only looks like that out in the districts, it has a policy and other corollary as well. Because what I think it looks like to leave English learners behind is no primary language assessments, an English-only assessment system that's going to link, therefore, to an English-only accountability system, again, that will penalize bilingual programs, and will penalize schools with large numbers of English learners. Conferences on best practices for the Common Core in which there's little or no mention of English learners. Conferences on best practices for English learners that include a very rosy statement at the beginning or the end about biliteracy in the 21st century, but include no actual workshops or focus on bilingual approaches and the crucial role of home language. I see these things happening everywhere, and yeah, I'm worried. For me, hearing those voices, seeing what's happening around the state right now as the fast train of the Common Core coming down the pike, is just happening, juxtaposed with what I see in my SEAL classrooms of these little ones who are developing such powerful biliteracy skills and using that as a way to access this learning. It is the Common Core made real for them with the added benefit of biliteracy. And I see it, and I see the data coming out of it, and I see those engaged, active little ones and their brains working, and I juxtapose that to the almost total absence of any mention of biliteracy around the Common Core or an adequate focus on English learners. And it makes me just want to weep that this, again, may well be an era that leaves our little ones behind and our populations behind. Some of the people who come to visit my SEAL program or read about it or hear about it say things like, oh, I'd love to be able to do this. This is amazing. But you know what? We don't have bilingual teachers. We could never do that. Or our board would never accept a bilingual program. Or our English learner parents just want English for their kids. We can't make them enroll in bilingual programs. So we have work to do. We have work to do for ourselves. We have work to do for the field so that English learners are not left behind, so that biliteracy is not left behind as the powerful answer to how to do the Common Core that it really should be. And so here are the imperatives I want us to leave you thinking about. On the long-term English learner side, we have to prevent the harm that's being done. We have to end the creation of long-term English learners, and we have to insist that the Common Core does not become a new vehicle to create yet more long-term English learners. On the English learner research side, let's enact what we know works. We've got this great research foundation. Let's make it real, let's make it known, and let's insist that what happens out there reflects it. And on the Common Core standards side, let's go for the huge promise that's in it, and let's guard against the new barriers. And we have to be the voices to make that happen. We have to be the voices that are insisting there can be no realization of the promise of the Common Core without full implementation of English language proficiency standards and without attention to the needs of English learners. And that includes development of their home language. And we have to say that again and again and again, even when it's not welcome, even when people look at us like we're crazy. We have to be the voices asserting that the Common Core requires investments in professional development and leadership development and program development related to meeting the needs of English learners, because to go ahead without all of those lacks in place is sure death for the education of our kids. And we have to be the voices declaring that the Common Core, you know what, it's great, this vision of college and career readiness for the 21st century, but it's actually pretty inadequate for the diverse world that we have become. Biliteracy and proficiency in multiple languages should also be an outcome of 21st century education. And we have to be the ones that are refusing to let this new school reform, yet another school reform, come down the pike, soak up all the resources, all of the energy, and leave behind English learners. Not this time, not again. Just like almost 100 years ago now, getting there, when the Mendez family and other Mexican-American families sued the Orange County school districts because their children were being foreclosed from an equal education because of the color of their skin and their culture and their language. Just like Chinese American parents argued on behalf of their kids all the way to the US Supreme Court that they were not going to let their kids be foreclosed from equal educational opportunity because they didn't speak English. So we too have to insist that this is not going to be an era that bypasses English learner kids, that we're going to see in them the tremendous resource that they are, and that we're going to recognize that their education is a gift to us. So thank you very much, and we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah. Okay, the question was about preschool thematic units, but there's no Common Core for preschool. Actually, what we did is we took the California Preschool Learning Foundations, we took the Desired Results Developmental Profile, which is used in state child development centers, and we looked in both of those for what are the measures that align with the Common Core standards, and that's what we used, yeah, for their thematic units. Any? Also for the little ones, where you're freed from sort of this notion about what they have to be learning, like what standards lay out, we go with what's interesting to them, what becomes really interesting to young minds, what is it that we have available resources that can make it really tangible and touchable. So you wouldn't do a unit on St. Patrick's Day or something, you know, what's tangible, what can they touch, what can they interact with, what's interesting to them. It's all thematic, and it's not just emergent, so that's an issue, because teachers plan it ahead. Yes?
You know, since the reality that you just mentioned about the, you know, teachers are just getting a handle of what Common Core means for their subject areas if they're elementary, or their subject area if they're secondary, what would you tell teachers at this moment? Because they don't have time, they're overwhelmed with the Common Core, and you know, yeah, they say we can't do both at the same time. It's almost too much multitasking, especially new teachers, but all teachers. Mm-hmm. What would be your suggestion for them? What they can do right now? And the second question is, right, you have a lot of people listen to you. So what are you doing right now to make sure that at a policy level, at a state level, what are you doing to make sure that they're not left behind? Mm-hmm.
So, wow. Couple big questions in there. Yeah. First, in reaction to, it is overwhelming to take on the Common Core, and for teachers that are really overwhelmed and they don't really have time, the solutions are very difficult to find at the individual teacher level right now. It's really much more of a system level. It's speaking to districts about the importance of collaboration time, the importance of of the investment in professional development, et cetera. But what I say to them is it's not like you do the Common Core first, and once teachers aren't overwhelmed with that, then you insert the ELD piece, because that is leaving them behind, and because they've done all this work in creating stuff, and then you have to revise it anyway. So it's wasted effort in a way. It's much better to look at it as slowing things down a little bit, rather than fill an entire year of Common Core units. Let's take on just 2 or 3 units this year, and really make it one in which you can do the integrated ELD with the others. So you're working with both sets of standards together, you're slowing it down. Everybody recognizes, the state implementation plan, et cetera, that this is transition time. The new assessments aren't going to be fully in place, including the ELD assessments, for a couple more years. We're not going to have adopted materials for the new standards for a couple more years, or state-approved materials, because the framework is just now coming out. So this is a time to slow it down so we can do it right, but to not allow one population to get ahead and another population to have to wait by the wayside. So that's one answer in there. You asked what I'm doing, the policy level. Well, one thing I'm really thrilled about is I was just named by Torlakson to the Public School Accountability Advisory Commission, and even though I'd been saying, I'm in my late 60s, I just want to say that, and I'm looking toward when can I retire, and my basic rule was your criteria has to be anything you take on can't add stress. But I looked at that and I thought, okay, one more thing, because we need an accountability system that is really going to be fair to English learners, be fair to schools with English learners, and give us a real picture of what's happening. So that's where that, plus the long-term English learner work, plus trying to get my SEAL project out there. We're now replicating in 16 new schools. We're looking for additional districts and schools that want to take it on. It's really a wonderful model, and so that's what I'm doing.